You've been told your whole life that debt is dangerous, that it's something to avoid, something to fear, something that keeps people trapped. And yet, quietly behind closed doors, the wealthiest people in the world are using debt every single day, not to survive, but to expand. That contradiction is not an accident, it's a system, and most people were never taught how it actually works. In this audiobook, How to Use Debt to Create Wealth, Rich Debt versus Poor Debt, you're going to uncover a perspective that shifts everything you thought you knew about money, control, and power. Because this isn't about numbers, this is about mindset. This is about seeing what others don't. And most importantly, this is about understanding the invisible line between debt that destroys your life and debt that builds it. We are going to walk through this step by step. You will discover how different groups of people think about money, how poor thinking traps people in cycles they never escape, how the middle class stabilizes but rarely scales, and how the wealthy use leverage like a tool, not a burden. We will break down the psychology, the strategy, and the emotional discipline required to use debt the right way. And before we go deeper, understand this clearly. This is not financial advice. This is awareness, because awareness changes decisions, and decisions change lives. Here's the truth most people avoid. Debt doesn't make you poor. Misunderstanding debt does. Let that sit with you for a moment, because everything you're about to hear builds on that one idea. And if you stay until the end, you won't just think differently. You'll see opportunities where others see risk. You'll recognize traps where others feel safe. And you'll understand why some people stay stuck no matter how hard they work, while others quietly multiply their results. So ask yourself, what if the problem was never debt? What if the problem was how you were taught to see it? And what if, starting today, you could change that lens? That's where our journey begins. Chapter 1, The Illusion of Safety. Most people don't chase wealth. They chase safety. They want to feel secure. They want stability. They want to avoid risk. And on the surface, that sounds responsible. That sounds smart. But here's where it gets dangerous. Safety, when misunderstood, becomes a cage. Because what feels safe is often just familiar. And what's familiar is not always what moves you forward. Think about this. A person works a job for 20 years. Same routine, same income structure, same ceiling. They feel safe. But are they growing? Are they expanding? Or are they just maintaining? This is where the illusion begins. Because the world teaches you to avoid debt at all costs, to eliminate it, to fear it, to see it as something negative by default. And while that advice protects people from certain mistakes, it also blinds them to certain opportunities. Because not all debt is the same. And this is the distinction that changes everything. There is debt that consumes you, and there is debt that builds you. There is debt that drains your future, and there is debt that accelerates it. But if you treat all debt as dangerous, you will avoid both. And that means you don't just avoid risk, you avoid growth. This is why so many people stay stuck. They're not lazy. They're not incapable. They're just operating from incomplete information. They've been conditioned to believe that debt-free is the ultimate goal. But here's a perspective shift that might challenge you. Debt-free is not the same as wealthy. Debt-free is often just neutral, zero. And zero does not move. Zero does not grow. Zero does not create. It just exists. And if you spend your entire life trying to reach zero, You might succeed, but you'll still be standing still. This idea was echoed in the mindset patterns found in high-performing financial thinkers, that the difference is not in effort, but in perception. Because effort alone does not create wealth. Direction does. So let's go deeper. Why do people avoid debt so aggressively? It's not just logic, it's emotion, fear of loss, fear of uncertainty, fear of making the wrong move. And those fears are real. They come from experiences, from stories, from watching others fail. But here's what most people don't realize. Avoiding all risk doesn't eliminate danger, it just shifts it. Because there is a silent risk in staying the same, a risk in not growing, a risk in not learning how money actually works. And that risk is invisible. It doesn't hit you all at once. It builds slowly, year after year, opportunity after opportunity, until one day you realize you've been playing defense your entire life, and you never learned how to play offense. This is where the wealthy think differently. They don't ask, how do I avoid debt? They ask, how do I use it? That one shift changes everything, because now debt is no longer something to fear. It becomes something to understand, to control, to direct. But before we get there, we need to break down the 3 different financial identities, because not everyone sees the world the same way, and your results are shaped by which perspective you operate from. The poor mindset, the middle-class mindset, and the wealthy mindset. Each one makes money differently, spends money differently, and most importantly, uses debt differently. In the next chapter, we're going to step into the first perspective, not to judge it, but to understand it. Because once you see the pattern, you can choose whether to stay in it or break out of it. And what you're about to realize might explain more about your current situation than you expect. Chapter 2, the poor mindset. Not poor in worth, not poor in potential, but poor in strategy. Because the difference between where someone is and where they could be is often just a shift in how they think. Let's slow this down. Most people who struggle financially are not doing it on purpose. They're working, they're trying, they're showing up every day. But their system, the way they've been taught to operate, is quietly working against them. And it starts with one idea. Time equals money. You've heard it before. You might even believe it. I work 1 hour, I get paid for 1 hour. Simple, logical, predictable, and limiting. Because if your income depends only on your time, then your income has a ceiling. No matter how hard you work, no matter how dedicated you are, there are only so many hours in a day. This is the first trap. And most people never question it. They just accept it. They build their entire life around it. Wake up, go to work, trade hours for income, repeat. Now here's where debt enters the picture. When someone operating in this mindset uses debt, it's usually for consumption, not creation. They borrow money to buy things that don't generate anything in return. Phones, clothes, cars beyond their means. Short-term comfort, long-term pressure. And again, this isn't about judgment. This is about awareness. Because if you don't understand the pattern, you can't change it. Think about this. If you borrow money for something that does not produce income, then you now have a payment. Without a new source of cash to support it, that's pressure, that's stress. That's why debt feels heavy. Because in this context, it becomes a weight you carry forward, month after month. And here's the deeper issue. It doesn't just affect your finances, it affects your decisions. Because now you need that job even more. You need that paycheck even more. You can't take risks. You can't explore opportunities. You can't breathe. And slowly, without realizing it, you trade freedom for stability. You lock yourself into a cycle, work to pay bills. Bills created by past decisions. Decisions driven by short-term thinking. And this is how people stay stuck for years. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they were never shown another way. As highlighted in the patterns of financial behavior we examined earlier, many people operate only with what they personally produce, without leverage, without expansion, relying entirely on their own effort over time. And that's exhausting, because you are the engine, and when you stop, everything stops. Now let's go deeper. Why does this cycle continue? Because it feels normal. Everyone around you is doing the same thing, same conversations, same goals. Pay off debt, save a little, stay safe, and again, nothing wrong with safety. But if safety becomes your only goal, you will never explore growth. This is where awareness becomes power. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You start asking different questions. Instead of, how do I avoid debt? You begin to ask, what kind of debt creates something? That question changes your direction. But we're not there yet. Because before you can shift strategies, you need to shift identity. You need to recognize the habits, the emotional patterns, the silent decisions that keep reinforcing this cycle. For example, impulse, buying something to feel better, to reward yourself, to escape stress, to keep up with others. These decisions feel small in the moment, but they compound. And over time, they shape your reality. This is why discipline matters, not just in work, but in thinking. Because your financial life is not built in one big decision. It's built in thousands of small ones every day. What you spend, what you save, what you avoid, what you justify. And here's the truth most people don't want to face. If your habits don't change, your results won't either. It's that simple and that hard. Because change requires awareness, and awareness requires honesty. You have to look at your situation without excuses, without blaming the system, without pointing at others and say, this is where I am. Because that's where power begins. As we've seen in other areas of growth, nothing shifts until you take ownership of where you stand and how you operate. Now here's the key insight. The poor mindset is not permanent. It's not a label. It's a pattern. And patterns can be changed. But only if you're willing to question what you've always accepted. Only if you're willing to feel uncomfortable. Only if you're willing to admit there might be another way. So let me ask you something. Right now, are you working for money, or is money working for you? Pause on that, because your answer to that question will tell you exactly where you are. And in the next chapter, we're going to explore the middle ground, the place where most people settle, where things look stable, where things feel controlled, but where growth quietly slows down. And what you'll discover there might be even more dangerous than the struggle you just left behind. Chapter 3. The Middle Class Trap. This is where things get quiet, not struggling, not desperate, not chaotic, just stable. And that's exactly why it's dangerous. Because instability forces change. But comfort convinces you to stay. The middle-class mindset is built on control, budgeting, planning, security, structure. It's the place where people do everything right. They go to school, they get a job, they build a career, they earn more over time. They upgrade their lifestyle slowly, and on the surface, it looks like success. But underneath, there's a hidden ceiling, because in this world, income grows, but so do expenses. A better job leads to a better apartment. A better apartment leads to higher bills. A higher salary leads to a nicer car. And suddenly, every step forward comes with a new weight attached. So while it looks like progress, the margin doesn't really change. You're earning more, but you're also spending more. And this creates a quiet loop, a loop that doesn't feel like struggle, but also doesn't lead to freedom. This is the middle class trap, and it's reinforced by one powerful belief: be responsible with money. Again, nothing wrong with that. But here's the question most people never ask: responsible according to who? Because responsibility in this context often means avoid risk. Stay within limits. Don't make mistakes. And that sounds smart until you realize growth requires calculated risk, expansion requires discomfort, and wealth requires leverage. But in the middle-class mindset, leverage is still feared. Debt is still seen as something to minimize, not something to use. So what happens? People save, they invest slowly, they pay down liabilities, they build stability. And again, there is value in that, but there is also a limit, because saving alone does not create scale. Working alone does not create freedom, and avoiding risk does not create opportunity. It just maintains position, and that's the key word. Maintain. The middle class is excellent at maintaining lifestyle, maintaining stability, maintaining control. But wealth is not built on maintenance. It's built on multiplication, and multiplication requires a different approach. Now let's talk about debt in this mindset, because this is where things get interesting. Middle-class individuals don't usually take on reckless debt. They're careful. They think things through. But the debt they do take on is still often tied to lifestyle. A mortgage for a home they live in, a car loan, education loans. Again, these are common, normal, expected. But here's the deeper question. Do these debts produce income, or do they require income? Because there is a difference, a big one. If something requires your income to sustain it, it's not building your freedom. It's depending on your effort. And the moment your effort stops, the system starts to crack. This is why so many people feel pressure, even when they're doing well. Because everything is connected to their personal output, their job, their time, their consistency. And that creates a fragile structure, stable, but sensitive, strong, but dependent. And this is where most people stay for years, sometimes decades, because it feels safe, because it's what everyone else is doing, because stepping outside of it feels uncertain. But here's the truth. Comfort doesn't just slow growth. It disguises stagnation. Let that sit. Because this is not about criticizing stability. It's about recognizing its limits. The middle class builds a strong foundation, but many never build beyond it. They stop at stability. They don't move into strategy. They don't shift into leverage. They don't ask, how do I make money work for me? And this is where the real shift begins. Because once you ask that question, everything changes. You stop thinking only about earning, and you start thinking about positioning. You stop focusing only on saving, and you start focusing on multiplying. You stop avoiding debt completely, and you start asking, what kind of debt builds something? This is the doorway, the transition point, the moment where you begin to move from control to creation. And it's not easy, because it requires unlearning. It requires questioning beliefs you've held for years. It requires stepping into uncertainty. But it also opens something powerful: choice. Because now, you're no longer just maintaining your life, you're designing it. And that leads us to the next level: the perspective that most people never fully understand. Not because it's complicated, but because it challenges everything they've been taught. In the next chapter, we step into the mindset of the wealthy, not to idolize it, but to decode it, to understand how they see debt, why they use it, and how they turn it into something most people never experience: acceleration. And what you're about to hear might completely redefine what you thought wealth actually was. Dear friend, we are just starting to work on this channel, so your likes and subscriptions will greatly help us grow. Don't be indifferent. Thank you. Chapter 4, The Wealth Mindset. This is where everything changes, not because the rules are different, but because the perspective is. The wealthy don't see money the way most people do. They don't see it as something to earn. They see it as something to position. They don't ask, how hard do I need to work? They ask, how can I make this work without me? That shift is everything, because now time is no longer the main resource. Systems are, assets are, leverage is, and this is where debt transforms. In the previous mindsets, debt was something to avoid or something to manage. Here, debt becomes a tool, not emotional, not personal, strategic, calculated, controlled, and the difference comes down to one question: does this debt produce income, or does it consume it? Because wealthy individuals use debt to acquire assets, things that generate cash flow, things that grow in value, things that work even when they don't. Let's slow that down. Imagine borrowing money, not to spend, but to build something that pays you back over and over again. Now imagine that thing not only covers the cost of the debt, but also leaves profit behind. That's a completely different experience, because now debt is no longer pressure, it's leverage. And leverage, when used correctly, multiplies results. This is why wealthy individuals often borrow money, even when they could pay in cash. And this confuses a lot of people. Why take on debt if you don't need to? Because cash is power, and using all of it in one place limits your ability to move. But using debt allows you to expand while preserving your position. It allows you to control more with less. That's leverage. And leverage is one of the most misunderstood concepts in wealth creation, because people associate it with risk. But here's the truth. Everything has risk. Working one job has risk. Relying on one income stream has risk. Avoiding growth has risk. The question is not whether risk exists. The question is, do you understand it? Do you manage it? Do you use it intentionally? Because the wealthy don't eliminate risk. They learn to navigate it. They learn to structure it. They learn to make it work in their favor. And debt, when used correctly, becomes one of the most powerful tools in that process. But let's be clear. This is not about reckless borrowing. This is not about chasing quick wins. This is about discipline, clarity, control. Because leverage amplifies everything. If your strategy is weak, it magnifies mistakes. If your thinking is unclear, it magnifies confusion. But if your system is strong, it magnifies results. That's the difference. And this is why mindset comes first. Because without the right thinking, the same tool that builds wealth can destroy it. Now let's go deeper. Wealthy individuals focus on acquiring assets, not just income. because income is active. Assets are scalable. Income depends on your effort. Assets can operate independently, and this is where debt fits in. Debt becomes the bridge between where you are and what you can control. It allows you to step into opportunities before you fully own them. It accelerates your entry. It expands your reach, but only if you use it with intention. This is why education matters. Not just formal education, but financial awareness. Understanding how money moves, how systems work, how value is created. Because without that understanding, debt is dangerous. But with it, debt becomes a tool of expansion. And here's a powerful truth to hold on to. The wealthy don't use debt to buy things. They use debt to buy income. That line alone can change how you see everything. Because now, every financial decision becomes a question. Is this building something? Or is this just costing me something? Is this creating future value? Or just temporary satisfaction? And once you start asking those questions, your behavior begins to shift. You pause more. You think deeper. You become intentional. And that's where control begins. Now, I want you to reflect for a moment. If you had access to capital right now, would you know how to use it? Not spend it. Use it. Would you know how to turn it into something that grows? Something that pays you back? Something that builds your future? Because that's the real difference. It's not access to money. It's the ability to deploy it. And that ability is learned, built, refined over time. This is why most people stay where they are, not because they lack opportunity, but because they haven't developed the skill to recognize and use it. And that's what we're building here: awareness, clarity, perspective. Because once you see how the system works, you stop reacting to money and you start directing it. And in the next chapter, we're going to break this down even further. We're going to separate debt into two clear categories: simple, direct, unmistakable, so you never confuse them again. Because once you understand this distinction, every financial decision becomes sharper, cleaner, more intentional, and you begin to move with purpose instead of pressure. Chapter 5, Rich Debt versus Poor Debt. This is the line, the dividing point, the moment where confusion ends and clarity begins. Because until now, debt has been one word, one concept, one emotional reaction. But from this point forward, you will never see it as one thing again. There are two types of debt, and they lead in completely different directions: poor debt and rich debt. Let's begin with the first, poor debt. This is the kind of debt most people are familiar with, the kind that feels heavy, the kind that creates pressure, the kind that keeps people stuck. Poor debt is simple to identify. It takes money out of your pocket and gives nothing back. No return, no growth, no expansion, just obligation. You borrow, you spend, and then you repay with your future effort. This is the debt used for consumption, and consumption by itself does not build wealth. It creates temporary satisfaction, a short-term feeling, a moment of relief. But the cost stays long after the feeling is gone, and this is where the cycle deepens. Because poor debt often feels justified in the moment. I deserve this. I'll figure it out later. It's not that much. And one decision doesn't seem like much. But patterns are not built in one decision. They're built in repetition. And repetition creates direction. This is how people slowly move further away from financial freedom without realizing it, because each decision feels small. But together, they shape your future. And here's the deeper truth: poor debt doesn't just take money, it takes options, because every payment you commit to reduces your flexibility. Every obligation you carry limits your ability to move, to pivot, to take risks, to explore opportunities, and slowly, without realizing it, you build a life that depends on stability, because you can't afford instability. This is why poor debt is dangerous, not just financially, but mentally, because it conditions you to play it safe, to avoid risk, to stay where you are, and over time, that becomes your identity. Now let's contrast that. Rich debt. This is where everything shifts. Rich debt is not about spending, it's about positioning. It's not about consuming, it's about creating. Rich debt is used to acquire something that produces value, something that generates income, something that grows, and most importantly, something that works independently of your time, because now the equation changes. You borrow, but what you acquire pays you back. And if structured correctly, it pays for itself. And then it pays you. This is the key difference. Poor debt takes from your future. Rich debt builds your future. Let that sink in, because that one distinction changes how you evaluate every financial decision. Now, here's where people get confused. They think rich debt is risk-free. It's not. It requires understanding. It requires discipline. It requires strategy. Because if you misuse it, it becomes poor debt instantly. The tool is neutral. The user determines the outcome. That's why mindset matters more than mechanics. Because two people can take the same loan and end up in completely different realities. One builds something, the other carries something. One creates income, the other creates obligation. Same tool, different thinking. And this is why education is critical. Because without it, you're guessing. And guessing with leverage is dangerous. Now let's go deeper. Why don't more people use rich debt? Why isn't this more common? Because it requires delayed gratification. It requires patience. It requires thinking long term. And most people are trained to think short term. Immediate results, immediate comfort, immediate reward. But wealth is built on delay, on discipline, on decisions that don't feel exciting in the moment, but compound over time. This is why so many people never cross this line. Because the habits required to use rich debt are not common. They require control, focus, clarity, and as we've seen across all areas of growth, the ability to stay disciplined when it's uncomfortable is what separates those who move forward from those who stay stuck. Now I want you to reflect again. Look at your current situation, your current obligations, your current financial structure. Ask yourself honestly, is this building something or is this maintaining something? Because there is a difference, and your answer will tell you exactly where you stand. Now here's the powerful part. You are not locked into one category. You are not defined by past decisions. You're not stuck in one pattern forever. You can shift, but only if you become aware. Only if you take ownership. Only if you decide to think differently. Because everything we've talked about so far is not about money. It's about perspective, and perspective changes behavior. Behavior changes results, and results change lives. In the next chapter, we're going to go even deeper. We're going to break down how the wealthy actually structure debt. Not just the idea, but the thinking behind it, the principles they follow, the filters they use, so you can begin to see the world through a completely different lens. And once you see it, you won't be able to go back. Chapter 6. How the wealthy actually use debt. Now we move from idea to execution, because understanding the difference between rich debt and poor debt is powerful. But knowing how to apply it, that's where transformation begins. The wealthy don't just use debt randomly. They don't borrow because they can. They borrow because it fits a system, a structure, a clear intention, and that intention is always the same: to create something that produces more than it costs. That's the filter. Simple, but not easy. Because to apply that filter, you need clarity. You need discipline. And most importantly, you need to think in outcomes, not emotions. Let's break this down. When a wealthy individual considers using debt, they don't start with the loan, they start with the asset. What am I acquiring? What does it produce? What is the expected return? What is the risk? What is the timeline? Only after those questions are answered does debt even enter the conversation. This is a critical shift because most people start with the money. How much can I borrow? But the wealthy start with the value. What can this create? That difference changes everything, because now debt is not the goal. It's the bridge, a tool used to access an opportunity, not to find it. Now let's go deeper. The wealthy think in terms of cash flow, not just cost. Cash flow, movement, direction. Is money coming in or going out? And how consistently? Because if you acquire something with debt and it produces steady income, you're not just covering the cost, you're building momentum, you're creating a system, and systems scale. This is why wealthy individuals focus on assets that can operate independently, real estate that generates rent, businesses that generate revenue, investments that produce returns. They are not just buying things, they are building engines, and those engines are fueled by leverage. Now here's where discipline becomes critical, because not every opportunity is a good one. Not every deal makes sense. Not every asset performs. And this is where many people fail. They see the idea of leverage, but skip the evaluation. They rush. They assume. They act without clarity. And that's where risk becomes danger. But the wealthy do the opposite. They slow down, they analyze, they ask deeper questions. What happens if this underperforms? What is my downside? What is my margin for error? Because leverage amplifies outcomes, so they prepare for both directions. This is not fear, this is control. Because when you understand your risk, you can manage it. And when you manage it, you can move with confidence. Now let's talk about something most people overlook: patience. The wealthy are not chasing quick wins. They are building long-term systems. They are thinking in years, not days. And this is where most people disconnect. Because in a world of instant gratification, long-term thinking feels slow, it feels boring, it feels uncertain. But here's the truth. Speed without direction leads nowhere, and direction requires patience. Because real wealth is not built in one move, it's built in layers, decisions stacked over time, systems built gradually, results compounding quietly. This is why emotional control matters. Because if you react to every fluctuation, every delay, every uncertainty, you will never stay consistent long enough to see results. And consistency is where the real power is. As we've seen in other areas of life, the ability to stay focused and disciplined over time is what creates transformation, not sudden bursts of action. Now I want you to imagine something. Imagine you build one system, one asset, that generates income consistently, not massive, not life-changing at first, but stable, predictable. Now imagine using that income to build another and another and another. Over time, you are no longer dependent on one source. You are building a network, a structure, a machine, and each piece of that machine was created using leverage, using strategy, using intention. That's how wealth is built, not in one leap, but in layers. Now here's the key insight. Debt is not the foundation. Value is. Debt is just the accelerator. And if you try to use the accelerator without a direction, you crash. But if you combine it with clarity, you move faster, further, more efficiently. So the question is not, should you use debt? The question is, are you ready to use it correctly? Because that requires more than knowledge. It requires discipline. It requires self-control. It requires the ability to delay gratification in a world that rewards immediacy. And that's where most people struggle, not because they don't understand, but because they don't apply. Because understanding is passive, application is active, and action is what changes everything. In the next chapter, we're going to go even deeper into the psychology. Because before you ever use debt correctly, you have to master something even more important. Your impulses, your emotions, your decision-making patterns. Because if you don't control those, no strategy will save you. And what you're about to discover might be the real reason most people never build wealth, even when they have the opportunity. Dear viewers, write which city you're from. It's interesting to see which corners of the world are watching our videos. Chapter 7. The psychology behind debt. Before strategy, before systems, before leverage, there is one thing that determines everything: your mind. Because money does not control you. Your reactions to money do, and debt, more than anything else, exposes those reactions. It reveals your patterns, your impulses, your fears, your habits. That's why two people can have the same opportunity and create completely different outcomes. Because the difference is not the tool, it's the person using it. Let's go deeper. Most people don't make financial decisions logically. They make them emotionally. They buy when they feel stressed. They spend when they feel rewarded. They justify when they feel pressure. And they avoid when they feel fear. This is the cycle, and debt becomes the amplifier. Because when emotions drive decisions, debt follows without structure, without clarity, without intention, and that's when it becomes dangerous, not because debt itself is bad, but because the decision behind it was weak. This is why discipline is not optional. It's foundational, because without discipline, you don't control your choices. Your emotions do, and emotions are inconsistent. They change daily, sometimes hourly. One moment you feel confident, the next, uncertain. One moment you feel focused, the next, distracted. And if your financial decisions are tied to those fluctuations, your results will be unstable. This is where most people lose control, not because they lack knowledge, but because they lack consistency. They know what to do, but they don't do it consistently. And that gap between knowing and doing is where most people stay stuck. As highlighted in performance-focused thinking, success is not about what you understand occasionally, but what you apply consistently under pressure. Now let's talk about impulse, because impulse is one of the strongest forces in financial behavior. The desire to act quickly, to get immediate results, to feel progress now. And in a world built on speed, impulse is constantly triggered. Notifications, ads, social media, comparisons. Everything is designed to push you toward quick decisions, and quick decisions often lead to poor debt because they skip analysis, they skip reflection, they skip intention, they go straight to action, and action without clarity creates consequences. Now contrast that with control. Control is slower, more deliberate, more intentional. It requires you to pause, to think, to evaluate. And that pause is where better decisions are made. This is why wealthy individuals don't rush. They don't chase urgency. They create structure, because structure protects them from impulse. Structure creates consistency, and consistency creates results. Now here's something important. Emotional control is not about eliminating feelings. It's about managing them, understanding them, not letting them dictate your actions, because you will feel temptation, you will feel pressure, you will feel uncertainty. That doesn't go away, but your response to those feelings can change, and that's where power is built. Now, let's connect this back to debt. If you take on debt impulsively, without a clear plan, without a clear outcome, without understanding the structure, you are not using leverage. You are exposing yourself. And exposure without control leads to instability. But if you approach debt with discipline, with clarity, with intention, it becomes a tool, a calculated move, a strategic decision. And this is the difference, not the debt itself, but the mindset behind it. Now, I want you to ask yourself something honestly. When you make financial decisions, are you reacting, or are you thinking? Are you following emotion, or are you following strategy? Because your answer will reveal your pattern, and patterns predict outcomes. This is why awareness is everything. Because once you see your patterns, you can change them. But if you ignore them, they control you. And this is not just about money. This is about your life. Because the same discipline that builds wealth builds everything else. Focus, consistency, control, the ability to delay gratification, the ability to act with intention. These are universal. They show up everywhere. And if you build them here, they will carry into every area of your life. Now here's the truth most people don't want to hear. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your habits. And if your habits are driven by impulse, your results will always be inconsistent. But if your habits are built on discipline, your results will compound quietly, powerfully, over time. In the next chapter, we're going to take everything you've learned so far and bring it into real-world application. We're going to explore how to start shifting your current situation, how to move from where you are to where you want to be. Because understanding is the beginning, but action is where transformation happens. And what you're about to see next might be the moment everything starts to click. Chapter 8, From Awareness to Action. This is the turning point, because everything you've heard so far means nothing if it stays in your head. Awareness without action is just entertainment. And this is where most people stop. They listen, they feel motivated, they understand the concepts, and then they go back to the same patterns, the same habits, the same decisions, and nothing changes. Not because they can't change, but because they don't translate knowledge into behavior. So this chapter is different. This is where we begin the shift from thinking to doing, but not in a rushed way, not in a reactive way, in a controlled, intentional, strategic way. Because remember, this is not about moving fast. It's about moving correctly. Let's start with something simple: clarity. Before you change anything, you need to see where you are, not where you think you are, not where you hope to be, where you actually are. Your current income, your current expenses, your current debts, your current habits, no filters, no excuses, just truth. Because without truth, there is no direction. And without direction, there is no progress. This is where ownership begins the moment you stop blaming and start observing. Because the truth is, your current situation is a result of past decisions, not luck, not fate, decisions. And that's powerful. Because if decisions created your current reality, new decisions can create a different one. That's control. Now let's take the next step: separation. You need to separate your current debt. Not all of it is the same. Some of it is poor debt. Some of it might have potential. But until you categorize it, you can't manage it. So ask yourself, which of my current obligations are producing something and which are just costing me? Be honest, because clarity here is everything. Now here's where people get uncomfortable, because once you see it, you can't ignore it. You see the patterns, you see the leaks, you see the decisions that felt small but created long-term impact. And that discomfort is necessary because it forces awareness, and awareness forces change. Now let's move forward. Once you've identified your current structure, you need to create space, because you cannot build while you are overwhelmed. You cannot think strategically when you are reacting constantly. So the first move is not expansion, it's stabilization. Control your spending, reduce unnecessary pressure, create breathing room, not forever, but enough to think clearly, because clarity requires space, and space requires discipline. This is where many people fail. They want to jump straight into growth, straight into leverage, straight into opportunity. But without a stable base, that growth collapses. So slow down, stabilize first, then build. Now, here's the next step: education, not theory, not surface-level knowledge. Real understanding: how assets work, how cash flow works, how value is created, because you cannot use leverage effectively if you don't understand what you're leveraging into. And this is where most people skip. They want results without learning the process. But the process is the protection. It's what keeps you from making costly mistakes. It's what allows you to move with confidence. So take the time. Study. Observe. Learn from those who have done it correctly. Because every skill you build here compounds later. Now let's talk about opportunity. Because once you stabilize, once you educate, you begin to see things differently. You begin to notice patterns, gaps, possibilities, things you didn't see before. And that's not coincidence. That's awareness expanding, because opportunities are always there. Most people just don't recognize them. But now, you start asking different questions. Not, what can I afford? But what can this create? Not, is this expensive? But is this valuable? And that shift opens new doors. Now here's where discipline returns, because not every opportunity is for you. Not every idea is worth pursuing. And this is where control matters. You don't chase everything. You evaluate, you filter, you decide. Because focus is what turns potential into results. Scattered action creates scattered outcomes. Focused action creates momentum, and momentum changes everything. Now let's connect this back to debt, because eventually you will face a decision to use it or not. And when that moment comes, you don't act emotionally, You don't act impulsively. You act strategically. You ask, does this create income? Does this build value? Does this align with my direction? If the answer is unclear, you wait, because waiting is a strategy. Rushing is a risk, and patience is power. As we've seen across all growth principles, the people who win are not the ones who move the fastest, but the ones who stay consistent and intentional over time. Now, I want you to pause right here and reflect. What is one decision, one small shift you can make today that moves you closer to control? Not everything, not all at once, just one. Because transformation doesn't start with massive change. It starts with direction, one step, taken consistently, and that step leads to the next and the next, until one day you look back and realize you're no longer in the same place. In the next chapter, we're going to go even deeper into building that direction. We're going to talk about how to start thinking like an investor, not just an earner, because that shift is what separates those who work for money from those who make money work for them. And once you make that shift, everything begins to accelerate. Chapter 9. Think like an investor. This is where identity shifts, because up until now, most people operate as earners. They focus on income, on effort, on time. They think in terms of work and reward. But investors think differently. They don't just ask how to earn. They ask how to multiply. They don't just look at what something costs. They look at what it returns. And this shift from earner to investor is one of the most powerful transitions you can make. Because once it happens, you stop seeing money as something to hold, and you start seeing it as something to deploy. Let's slow this down. An earner asks, how much will I make? An investor asks, what will this become? That difference changes every decision, because now you're not just thinking about today. You're thinking about trajectory, direction, outcome over time. And this is where most people struggle, because thinking like an investor requires patience. It requires discipline. It requires the ability to delay immediate reward for long-term gain. And in a world built on instant gratification, that's not easy. But it's necessary, because wealth is not built on what you earn. It's built on what you do with what you earn. Let that sink in. Because you can increase your income, but if your thinking stays the same, your results won't. Now let's connect this to debt, because this is where the investor mindset becomes critical. When an earner uses debt, they think about the payment, the cost, the obligation. When an investor uses debt, they think about the return, the structure, the outcome. They ask, will this produce more than it costs? Will this create momentum? Will this move me forward? And if the answer is no, they don't proceed, no matter how appealing it looks, because discipline is more important than opportunity. Let's go deeper. Investors think in systems, not just transactions. They don't chase one deal, one result, one outcome. They build structures that repeat, that scale, that compound. And this is where leverage becomes powerful, because leverage, combined with systems, creates acceleration. But only if the system is sound. Because if the system is weak, leverage magnifies the weakness. So the focus is always on the foundation, clarity, structure, understanding. Because once that is in place, everything else builds on top of it. Now here's something most people overlook. Investors are not emotional about money. They are intentional. They don't fall in love with decisions. They don't chase feelings. They follow logic, structure, strategy, because emotion clouds judgment, and judgment is everything. This is why emotional control, which we talked about earlier, is not optional. It's essential. Because if you react emotionally, you will make inconsistent decisions. And inconsistent decisions create unstable outcomes. Now let's talk about risk, because this is where most people hesitate. They think investors are fearless. They're not. They just understand risk differently. They don't avoid it. They evaluate it. They measure it. They manage it. They ask, what is the downside? What is the worst-case scenario? Can I handle it? And if the answer is unclear, they don't move, because clarity comes before action. Always. Now here's the key insight. Investors don't wait for perfect conditions. They prepare for imperfect ones. Because there is no perfect moment, there is only preparation. And preparation creates confidence. Confidence not based on emotion, but on understanding. Now, I want you to reflect again. When you look at opportunities, do you see risk or do you see potential? Do you focus on what could go wrong or what could be built? Because your focus shapes your decisions, and your decisions shape your results. Now, here's where the shift becomes real. Thinking like an investor is not about having money. It's about having perspective. Because you can start small. You can start with limited resources. But if your thinking is correct, you can build step by step, layer by layer, system by system, and over time, that thinking compounds, just like your results. This is why mindset always comes first, because without it, you will sabotage your own progress. You will hesitate when you should act, and act when you should pause. But with it, you move with clarity, with intention, with direction, and that's where power is built. Now, here's something important. You don't become an investor overnight. This is a transition, a process, a shift that happens gradually through learning, through experience, through decisions. Some right, some wrong, but all valuable, because every decision teaches you something, and that knowledge becomes your advantage. Now, as you move forward, there is one principle I want you to hold on to. Don't focus on how much money you make. Focus on how many systems you build. Because systems create freedom. Systems create stability. Systems create scale. And debt, when used correctly, becomes the fuel for those systems. Not the burden, the fuel. In the next chapter, we're going to go deeper into building those systems. We're going to explore how to identify real opportunities and how to avoid the ones that look good, but lead nowhere. Because not everything that looks like growth is growth. And what you're about to learn next will sharpen your ability to tell the difference. Chapter 10, How to Recognize Real Opportunities. Not everything that looks like growth is growth. And this is where many people make their biggest mistakes. Because when you first begin to shift your mindset, when you start thinking like an investor, you become more aware, more open, more curious. And suddenly, you start seeing opportunities everywhere. Ideas, deals, offers, possibilities. And at first, that feels exciting. It feels like progress. But here's the truth. More options does not mean better direction. Because without filters, you don't have opportunity. You have distraction. And distraction is one of the fastest ways to lose momentum. So this chapter is about clarity, about sharpening your ability to see what actually matters and what doesn't. Let's begin with a simple principle. Real opportunities are not loud. They don't scream for attention. They don't rush you. They don't pressure you. In fact, most real opportunities feel calm, structured, clear, because they are built on logic, not emotion. Now contrast that with false opportunities. They feel urgent. They feel exciting. They promise quick results. They trigger emotion, fear of missing out, excitement, greed, and that emotional spike is what pulls people in. But emotion is not a signal of value. It's a signal of stimulation. And stimulation can be misleading. So the first filter is this. If it feels rushed, pause, because urgency removes clarity. And clarity is your protection. Now let's go deeper. A real opportunity answers 3 questions clearly. What does it produce? How does it produce it? And what are the risks? If you cannot answer those questions simply, you don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, you should not move. It's that simple. Because confusion is a warning, not a challenge to overcome. Now here's where discipline comes in. Because sometimes you will want to move anyway. You will feel the pull, the excitement, the possibility. And this is where most people fail. They override logic with emotion. They convince themselves. They justify. And they act. But disciplined individuals do the opposite. They slow down. They question. They wait. Because waiting is not weakness. Waiting is control. Now let's connect this to debt. Because this is where mistakes become expensive. If you attach debt to a weak opportunity, you amplify the problem. You don't just lose time. You lose money. You lose flexibility. You lose options. And that's a heavy cost. So the rule is simple. Never use leverage on something you don't fully understand. Let that sit. Because this one principle can protect you from years of setbacks. Now let's talk about something deeper. Alignment. Not every good opportunity is good for you. And this is where clarity matters. Because your direction determines your decisions. If something doesn't align with your path, it doesn't matter how good it looks. It's still a distraction. This is why focus is critical. Because focus filters opportunity. It helps you say no to things that don't serve your direction. And saying no is one of the most powerful skills you can build. Because every yes costs you something. Time, energy, attention. And if you say yes to the wrong things, you move further away from what matters. Now, here's a powerful truth. Opportunities don't change your life. The right opportunities, applied consistently, do. Because one decision is not enough. It's the repetition, the structure, the system that creates results. Now let's go deeper into evaluation. When you look at an opportunity, don't just ask what it could become. Ask what it requires. Time, effort, skill, risk. Because every opportunity has a cost. Not just financially, but mentally. And if you underestimate that cost, you create pressure, and pressure leads to poor decisions. Now here's something important. You don't need to chase opportunities. You need to become the person who recognizes them. Because when your thinking improves, your awareness improves. And when your awareness improves, you see things others miss. Patterns, value, potential. And that's where your advantage is. Not in speed, not in luck, in clarity. Now I want you to reflect again. Think about the last decision you made. Financially, was it based on clarity or emotion? Was it aligned or impulsive? Because that answer tells you everything. And here's the good news. You can improve this. You can sharpen your thinking. You can build discipline. You can train yourself to pause before acting, and that pause is where better decisions are made. Now, as you move forward, there is one principle I want you to hold on to. Clarity before action, always. Because action without clarity creates chaos, but clarity creates direction, and direction creates results. In the next chapter, we're going to take this even further. We're going to talk about building your first real system. Not theory, not ideas, a practical shift, something you can begin to apply. Because this is where everything starts to become real. And once you take that first step, you're no longer just learning, you're building. Hang on a sec. Write in the comments what you'd like us to talk about in the next video. We promise to read all the comments and pick the best and most relevant topics. Thanks. Chapter 11. Build your first wealth system. This is where everything becomes real. Not theory, not ideas, not inspiration, structure. Because wealth is not built on motivation. It's built on systems. And if you don't build systems, you will always depend on effort. And effort alone will always have limits. So let's slow this down. What is a system? A system is something that produces a result consistently, without requiring constant input. It's repeatable, predictable, scalable, and most importantly, it works even when you're not actively working. That's the goal, not just to earn money, but to create something that continues to generate, with or without you. Now here's where most people get stuck. They overcomplicate this. They think systems require massive capital, complex strategies, perfect timing. But the truth is, every system starts small, simple, focused, because complexity without clarity leads to confusion, and confusion stops action. So your first system does not need to be perfect. It needs to be functional. It needs to produce something, even if it's small, because small, consistent results build confidence, and confidence builds momentum. Now let's connect this to debt, because eventually you may choose to use leverage. But here's the rule. You don't use debt to create your first idea. You use it to expand something that already works. Let that sink in, because this is where many people fail. They try to force growth before proving stability. They borrow before understanding. They scale before validating. And that creates pressure, but the disciplined approach is different. You build first, you test, you refine, you understand the system, and only then do you consider expansion. Because now, you're not guessing, you're building on evidence. Now let's talk about simplicity. Your first system should answer one question clearly. How does this generate income? Not maybe, not potentially, clearly. Because clarity here is your foundation. Now here's where focus matters. You don't need multiple systems at the beginning. You need one that works, one that you understand, one that you can improve. Because scattered effort creates scattered results. But focused effort creates momentum, and momentum is what changes everything. Now let's go deeper. A system requires three things: input, process, output. What goes in? What happens? What comes out? If you can define those clearly, you have structure, and structure creates consistency. Now, here's something important. Your system will not be perfect. At first, it will be inefficient, it will have gaps, it will require adjustment. That's part of the process, because systems are built through iteration, through learning, through refining, and this is where patience returns. Because improvement takes time, and time is where most people lose focus, They expect results too quickly. They get discouraged. They stop, and they never give the system enough time to work. But those who succeed stay with it. They adjust, they refine, they improve, and over time, the system becomes stronger, more efficient, more reliable. Now let's connect this back to mindset. Because building a system requires discipline, the ability to stay consistent, even when results are small, even when progress feels slow, even when no one is watching. Because this is where real growth happens, in the quiet, in the repetition, in the moments that don't feel exciting, but matter the most. As we've seen in other areas of success, consistency in small actions is what builds long-term results, not sudden bursts of effort. Now here's the powerful part. Once your first system works, everything changes because now you have proof, you have understanding, you have experience, and that experience is your foundation for growth. Now you can begin to think about expansion, about scaling, about using leverage, but this time, you're not guessing. You're building on something real, and that's the difference. Now I want you to reflect again. What is one system you could begin building? Not perfect, not massive, just functional. Because that first step is where everything begins. And once you take it, you're no longer just learning, you're creating. In the next chapter, we're going to take this further. We're going to explore how to scale, how to take something that works and expand it intelligently. Because scaling without structure leads to collapse, but scaling with clarity leads to acceleration. And that's where things start to move faster. Chapter 12, Scaling Without Losing Control. This is where things begin to accelerate, but also where things can fall apart. Because building something and scaling something are two completely different challenges. Building requires effort. Scaling requires structure. And if you try to scale without structure, you don't grow, you break. So let's slow this down. You now understand systems. You understand how to build something that works, even if it's small, even if it's simple. But now the question becomes, how do you expand it? How do you take something that produces a result and make it produce more? This is where most people get excited, and that excitement can become dangerous because growth feels good, progress feels good, momentum feels good. And when things start working, there's a temptation to move faster, to do more, to expand quickly. But here's the truth. Speed without structure creates instability, and instability destroys progress. So the first principle of scaling is this: protect what works. Don't rush to expand something that isn't stable, because if the foundation is weak, growth will expose it, not fix it. Now let's go deeper. Scaling is not about doing more work. It's about improving efficiency. It's about refining the system, removing friction, optimizing processes. Because the stronger your system becomes, the easier it is to expand. And this is where discipline returns again. Because refinement is not exciting, it's not flashy, it's not fast, but it's necessary. Because every improvement you make now multiplies later. Now let's connect this to leverage, because this is where debt begins to enter the picture again. Once your system is stable, once it produces consistent results, now you can consider expansion. And this is where rich debt becomes powerful. Because now, you're not borrowing to guess. You're borrowing to scale something proven. That's the difference. You already understand the system. You already know how it performs. You already know the risks. So now, Debt becomes a tool to accelerate, not to experiment, and that shift is everything, because now you're moving with clarity, not emotion. Now here's where control matters most, because when you scale, you increase exposure, more moving parts, more variables, more risk, and if you lose control, everything becomes fragile. So the goal is not just growth, it's controlled growth. Growth you can manage, growth you can sustain, growth you can understand. Now let's talk about something critical: margins. This is one of the most overlooked concepts in scaling, because when things are working, people assume they will keep working, but conditions change, markets shift, results fluctuate, and if you don't have margin, you have no protection. Margin is your buffer, your safety, your flexibility, and without it, one mistake, one shift, one unexpected event can collapse everything. This is why disciplined individuals always leave room. They don't push everything to the limit. They don't maximize risk. They manage it, because sustainability is more important than speed. Now here's a powerful truth. Scaling is not about how fast you grow. It's about how long you can sustain that growth. Let that sit. Because fast growth without sustainability leads to burnout, leads to collapse, leads to starting over, but steady, controlled growth builds something lasting. Now let's go deeper into mindset, because scaling tests your discipline. It tests your patience. It tests your ability to stay focused when things are moving, because when results improve, distractions increase, opportunities increase, noise increases, and if you lose focus, you lose direction. This is why clarity must remain constant, no matter how much you grow, because clarity is what keeps you aligned. It's what keeps you making the right decisions. It's what keeps you from chasing everything and mastering nothing. Now I want you to reflect. If what you're building right now started growing faster, would you be ready? Would your system handle it? Would your structure support it? Or would it break under pressure? Because scaling doesn't create problems. It reveals them. And what it reveals depends on what you've built. Now here's the good news. You can prepare for this. You can strengthen your foundation. You can refine your system. You can build with intention so that when growth comes, you're ready, not reactive. Now let's connect everything we've learned so far. You started with awareness. You understood the difference between rich debt and poor debt. You shifted your mindset. You built your first system. And now you're learning to scale step by step, layer by layer. And this is how wealth is built, not in one move, but in progression, in structure, in discipline. And in the next chapter, we're going to go even deeper, because there is one thing that can destroy everything you've built. If you don't understand it, risk. Real risk. Not imagined, not emotional, strategic. Because if you don't understand risk, you can't manage it. And if you can't manage it, you can't sustain growth. And what you're about to learn next might be the difference between building something that lasts and losing everything you've worked for. Chapter 13. Understanding Real Risk. This is where most people hesitate, not because they don't want to grow, but because they're afraid to lose, and that fear is not wrong. But it is often misunderstood, because most people don't actually understand risk. They feel it, they react to it, they avoid it, but they don't define it. And what you don't define, you can't control. So let's bring clarity to this. Risk is not the presence of uncertainty. Risk is the absence of understanding. Let that sit. Because uncertainty exists in everything. Every decision, every move, every opportunity. There is always something unknown. But the difference between fear and confidence is understanding. Because when you understand something, you can prepare for it. You can manage it. You can move with intention. But when you don't, you hesitate, you guess, or you avoid. And avoidance is not safety. It's stagnation. Now let's connect this to debt, because this is where fear becomes strongest. People say debt is risky, but what they really mean is, I don't understand how to control it. Because debt by itself is neutral. It's a tool. And like any tool, it can build or it can destroy, depending on how it's used. Now here's the difference between perceived risk and actual risk. Perceived risk is emotional. It's based on stories, on past experiences, on what you've heard. Actual risk is structural. It's based on numbers, on systems, on outcomes. And if you operate from perceived risk, you will avoid opportunities that could move you forward. But if you understand actual risk, you can evaluate those opportunities clearly. This is why wealthy individuals don't fear risk. They define it. They break it down. They ask specific questions. What is the downside? What is the worst case scenario? What is the probability? What is my margin for error? Because once those questions are answered, risk becomes measurable. And what is measurable is manageable. Now let's go deeper. There are 3 types of risk you need to understand: the risk of action, the risk of inaction, and the risk of ignorance. Most people focus only on the first. What if I lose money? What if this fails? What if it doesn't work? But they ignore the second. What if I stay the same? What if I miss the opportunity? What if I never learn how this works? And over time, the risk of inaction becomes greater than the risk of action, because opportunities don't wait, time doesn't pause, and the cost of staying the same compounds quietly year after year, decision after decision, until one day you realize you didn't lose by making a mistake. You lost by never moving. And then there's the third risk, the most dangerous one: ignorance, not knowing, not learning, not understanding how money works. Because ignorance creates blind decisions, and blind decisions lead to unnecessary losses. This is why education is not optional. It's protection. It's what allows you to move forward without guessing. Now here's something important. Managing risk is not about eliminating it. It's about controlling exposure, knowing how much you can handle, knowing your limits, knowing your margins. Because every decision carries risk, but not every decision carries the same level of exposure. And this is where discipline matters, because disciplined individuals don't overextend. They don't chase maximum returns. They balance risk and reward. They protect their position while building their future. Now let's connect this back to leverage, because leverage increases both potential and exposure. It amplifies outcomes. So if you use it without understanding risk, you increase your vulnerability. But if you use it with clarity, you increase your efficiency. That's the difference. Now I want you to reflect again. When you think about risk, what do you focus on? Loss, or learning, fear, or structure? Because your focus shapes your decisions, and your decisions shape your results. Now here's the powerful truth. Risk is not what holds people back. Misunderstanding risk does. Because once you understand it, you don't freeze, you don't avoid, you evaluate, you decide, You move. Now let's go deeper into control. Because managing risk requires more than knowledge. It requires emotional stability, the ability to stay calm when things don't go as planned, the ability to adjust without panicking. Because no system is perfect. No strategy is flawless. There will be setbacks. There will be challenges. And how you respond determines your outcome. This is why mindset and strategy are connected. Because strategy guides your actions, but mindset controls your reactions. And both are necessary. Now here's where everything comes together. You understand the difference between rich debt and poor debt. You understand systems. You understand scaling. And now you understand risk. And with that understanding, you gain something powerful. Control, not over everything, but over your decisions. And that's where freedom begins. Because when you control your decisions, you control your direction. And direction is what builds your future. In the next chapter, we're going to go even deeper. Because there is one thing that determines whether all of this works or falls apart. Your consistency. Because without consistency, nothing compounds, nothing grows, nothing lasts. And what you're about to discover next might be the most important piece of this entire journey. Chapter 14, The Power of Consistency. This is the part most people underestimate, not because it's complicated, but because it's simple. And simple is often ignored. You've learned about debt. You've learned about mindset. You've learned about systems. You've learned about risk. But none of it matters without consistency, because consistency is what turns knowledge into results. It's what turns ideas into outcomes. It's what turns potential into reality. Let's slow this down. Most people don't fail because they don't know what to do. They fail because they don't do it long enough. They start strong. They feel motivated. They take action. And then they stop. They lose focus. They get distracted. They fall back into old patterns, and everything resets again and again and again. Now, here's the final truth. The life you want is not built in massive changes. It's built in small decisions made with awareness. And that's where you are now. Aware, clear, focused. Now it's time to move quietly, consistently, intentionally, and build. If this audiobook shifted something in you, make a decision right now, not later, right now. Commit to one change. And if you're serious about it, hit like as a contract with yourself. Write in the comments the one decision you're making moving forward. Because when you declare it, you make it real. And if you know someone who is stuck, someone who is working hard but not moving forward, share this with them. Because sometimes one perspective changes everything. And if you want to stay consistent, if you want to keep building, then subscribe. Not for content, but for accountability, for reminders, for direction. Because this is not a one-time shift. This is a path. And paths require consistency. Now take a breath. Let everything settle. And remember this one line, the one that stays with you. Debt doesn't make you rich or poor. The way you think does. And from this moment forward, you think differently.